My name is Stephen Musgrave, and this is a response to the brief interview with Penn Gillette on the Red Eye program on Fox. And as many people know, Mr. Gillette is a stage musician, along with his partner, Keller. And he is, like many stage musicians, a member of the skeptical community. He is also a member of the Brights organization, which is a group of atheists who believe that there's a naturalistic explanation to everything. I myself am not a theist, so I have no quarrel with that whatsoever. But there are a number of things that I find interesting in some of the comments that were made in here that need to be addressed. One is Mr. Gillette's emotive energy in regards to removing God from the word God from money, because he feels it's a violation of the separation of church and state. While I tend to agree with him, and I, on the other hand, don't find it terribly relevant, nor do I find the peculiar Masonic markings on money, the all-seeing eye, etc., to be terribly relevant either. If anything, if I were a religionist, I would probably complain that they would blaspheme the holy name of God by putting it on money. That certainly would be the more traditional aspect of the Judeo-Christian tradition, but it's taken a turn for the strange in America, where wealth is considered a sign of God's grace. It's a merger of Calvinism and capitalism, so it was only natural that something like that would appear. What concerns me about the Brights movement and people like Mr. Gillette is that they also refer to themselves as rationalists. The implication being those that are religionists are not rational. This is a rather simplified view of things. For one, none of us are perfectly rational. The great philosopher von Willard Quine, probably one of the foremost philosophers of the 20th century, said that all of our beliefs are contained in a belief net, in which all of our thoughts and ideas and self-image are wrapped into that complex. And that being the case, an atheist or a non-believer is no more purely rational than a religionist. In fact, it has been shown that there is a direct relationship to one's parents and one's religiosity, but not only in the sense that Dawkins puts forward, that people mindlessly follow their parents' religion, which is kind of amusing, particularly since Dawkins' father was an atheist. But it also shows that negative relationships with your parents will lead to, particularly to your father, will lead to apostasy. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon. This does not mean because you're influenced by psychological factors or your personal history that holding a stance, either religious or non-religious, is necessarily invalidated. This is an argument that's made rather consistently by some atheists. It's basically what's called the generic fallacy. That is, if you describe the origins of something, you've invalidated its logic, but that simply isn't the case. Another comment that was made was by the host, who stated an often repeated claim that religion is based upon a fear of death. The problem with that is that doesn't hold up to rational scrutiny, simply because there were many religions that didn't have an afterlife. early Judaism, Hinduism before rebirth. The mound builders in America had belief that only the only people that had a rebirth were the chiefs of the tribe, and those were sacrificed to go with them. And there's many other rebirths, or I should say afterlives, that are vague if non-existent. In Hades, you were a shade, they would disappear when you were touched, and various other traditions have similar things. In fact, it looks like early religion was primarily concerned with success in the present life, fertility cults, good crops, children, protection from enemies, far more than there was an interest in the afterlife. That did develop later on. But we can't make an argument for that religion is based on any specific thing. It's a universal phenomenon. It exists in all cultures or during all times. So those who I suppose are evolutionary psychologists, such as Dawkins, and I would imagine that most of the people in the rights movement follow his lead in that, would say that it had some genetic component. That's from a geneticist standpoint, that's very simplistic. Genes are far more complicated than that, and they're not all powerful anyway. They are controlled by the biology of the cell, and as we know, genes can have multiple functions. The thing that bothers me about the Brights movement and the New Atheists is that they hold a point of view that is extremely belligerent and abusive towards anyone who disagrees with them. And this view, I believe, has developed into a cult of intellect. You can find this easily in their literature. That is, they believe that the mark of a person's value is their intellect. And the mark of a person's intellect is whether or not they agree with their opinions, particularly about religion and God. Now, this has a parallel to the ultra-Darwinist eugenics movement, which saw people as inferior genetically, and this, of course, led to some of the more tragic events in Western history. Contrary to the claims of Dawkins and Harris and others, Hitler was not a Christian. He, in fact, quite plainly stated that he believed Christianity was unnatural, that the strong had to defeat the weak or destroy the weak. Otherwise, animals would take over for men, insects would take over for animals, and microbes would eventually end up ruling the universe. This is quoted in a book called Murderous Science by Benno Mueller. It's about the science's role in the Third Reich. There are many things that are stated that simply aren't the case. If you're going to argue that you're a rationalist, then you need to maintain a rational perspective. You don't call people idiots or morons or whatever, no matter what their belief system is, because you're not going to convince them of anything doing that. They particularly employ these against the creationists who they abhor, and I admit that creationism is, from my perspective, illogical and defies physics and and chemistry and a number of other things. Common descent is a molecular certainty. Okay? There's no question about it. That does not mean that people cannot have views of evolution that are not ultra-Darwinistic or that might have some religious aspect. Many people in the past believed in what's called emanation, that is, that whatever was brought forward from nature emanated from God's will. So that could fit, they could fit evolution right in there. Natural selection, the whole thing. In fact, an early Muslim scholar essentially came up with this notion. So my point is, another point that disturbs me is that if you know anything about religion, if you've studied religion from a sociological aspect, you understand that religiosity is directly related to, as we talked about earlier, your relationships to your parents and the environment you grew up in, but also in your level of education, which is dictated in no small part by your affluence. The poor, the people that are less secure in their lives financially and face the greatest threats, according to surveys that have been run for the last 10 years by sociologists of religion, Pippa Norris and Robert Engelhardt, show that there is a direct relationship to security in a person and their views on religion, such as nations in Scandinavia where they have a great deal of a strong social net and a high level of education. There's a much greater number of agnostics and atheists. But to ridicule someone, particularly, for instance, let's say Appalachia or the Midwest, who are poor and have not had an opportunity to be educated, if you really want to lessen the intensity of their religiosity, the way to do it would be to support education for these individuals and for their community. You would not simply come back and call them names, which of course is exactly what they do. People like Trina Hooks of the Atheist Examiner and Dawkins and the late Harris, the late Hitchens. Nothing but epithets and no compassion. This is from a group of people that like to refer to themselves as humanists. But in actuality, many of them are inhumanists. Only people who are extremely affluent and have never experienced a lot of suffering, for instance, would come up with the idea that death is, and everyone fears death. If you suffered enough, people welcome death. That's why we have a phenomenon known as suicide. It simply doesn't, once again, hold up to any kind of rational scrutiny. So the point is, if you're going to make an argument against religionists, at least educate yourself about the facts. Don't approach anyone in an argument with an attitude that they're an idiot simply because they disagree with you. And the most frightening part of that is that since non-theists don't have a metaphysical ground for morality, they choose their own morality based on whatever their particular philosophy is. And that means, and of course I believe that atheists and anybody else can be moral. But when you add to that the idea that people are inferior to you because they don't have your intelligence, and you base intelligence upon, in no small part, their beliefs on religion, you're going down a road that is a very dangerous one. For as Nietzsche said, when you look into the abyss long enough, the abyss looks back. And that, I'm afraid, is what is going on with the new atheist movement. Thank you.